Hello, everybody. It's Nick Nanos from Nanos Research. I'm going to do a walkthrough the Ontario Culture Study that was commissioned by Business and Arts. The Ontario Arts Council was a contributor. This is a pretty significant piece of research that was conducted in Ontario. There's the questionnaire and the content was developed collaboratively with La Placa Clohan and Nanos and Business and Arts. And what I'm going to do is a bit of a walk through what we learned in this very important study. So the study itself was comprised of 1,012 individuals that live in the province of Ontario. These were people that were cultural consumers. By cultural consumers, we mean that they engage in at least one type of cultural activity. And we kind of considered this the target market to unpack where we are on the cultural front, at least in Ontario. And just from a transparency perspective, we wanted to show the profile of what I'll say, those Ontarians that engage in cultural activities compared to the general population. And you can see that by and large, that the numbers are fairly consistent across all of those groups. Anglophone means people that speak English, Francophone, those that speak French. Allophone, for those of you that don't know, are individuals in the province of Ontario that speak a language other than French or English. So, spotlight on allophones. Those would be those Ontarians that speak languages other than English or French. What's interesting is that they're more likely to participate in the benchmark arts compared to Anglophones. It looks like you can see the numbers in terms of classical music, jazz music, opera, ballet, basically right across the board, that if you're an allophone, if you speak a language other than English or French, you're more likely to plug into the benchmark arts. You know, you have to think of it this way. This basically is indicative of the diversity in Ontario. Many of those individuals that are allophones tend to live in larger urban centers that also have access to a lot of these benchmark arts. So you have to think of these Ontarians as a key target group that are already engaged, are plugged in, and are interested in the benchmark arts. The other thing is you know, to speak about the level of engagement. Not a big surprise. You can see, you know, allophones more likely to participate in a festival, especially if one's organized by an ethnic group. But similar numbers right across the board once we get beyond the benchmark arts into other types of cultural experiences, whether it's public street art, a film festival, a performing arts festival, an art gallery. And I think the key takeaway here is that for these allophones, for our fellow Ontarians that speak a language other than French or English, I think the key takeaway here is that they're highly engaged in culture and highly engaged in the community, and that they are plugged in to all these kind of different experiences. And the key takeaway is that the participation rates in most of the activities are higher than in Anglophones. And we have to remember that once we get outside of many of the large, high-density urban centers, that there are probably fewer allophones in those communities compared to the big urban hubs that also tend to be centers where many of the arts activities, festival, and culture is celebrated. Some of the key takeaways: you have to think of, when we look at cultural activities and what the key motivators are, you have to think of one word, social, as kind of like the key driver. And now we're talking about Ontarians writ large. And, when we ask Ontarians what the key drivers are to motivate people to attend any sort of cultural activities, at the very top of the list was having fun, followed by interest in the content, feeling relaxed, experience. So just think of different types of experiences: intellectual experiences, physical experience in terms of feeling good, having fun, and being exposed to new ideas as some of the key drivers. And the interesting thing is that by and large, the drivers for Anglophones and allophones are very consistent across the board when we look at this. But allophones, one particular outlier that's kind of interesting is that allophones are more likely to be interested in cultural activities that broaden their perspective or worldview. It's kind of like they're built in global citizens, right? Because they're speaking English and they're speaking another language. So they have a particular worldview and they're interested in broadening their experiences. But you know, the fact of the matter is that when we look at the top motivators, a lot of it has to do with what I'll call that social connectedness that people want to have as a top motivator to attend a cultural activity in Ontario. The downside, and this is interesting because many times we talk about barriers, why people might not participate or go to a cultural event or gathering. And many times, you know, anecdotally, whenever I'm asked, you know, Nick, you know, people say that the cost of tickets is too high. But you know, what's interesting is that when we look at the top barrier, this is a really eye-popping number. You can see 42% of people in the province of Ontario say it's not for someone like me, or that it's fundamentally location. You can see ticket price or the cost of admittance is the third ranked barrier. But you know, the key takeaway for here is that this whole idea of some Ontarians thinking that culture or a specific cultural activity is not for someone like them is actually, I would say, one of the key findings, at least from my perspective, in the Business for the Arts study that we did. And I think this should be perhaps a little bit of a wake-up call for some cultural activities and cultural organizations, leading cultural organizations in Ontario, basically just to ask themselves, you know, how welcoming are we? Our programming, how does our programming reflect the audience that we want to have, not necessarily just the audience that we do have, but the audience that we want to have. Not a big surprise that location is a factor, and we find this in a lot of our research in the cultural sector, that there are many Ontarians that are interested in participating in cultural types activities and having those social experiences, but geography is a problem. But I think the key takeaway here is, yeah, you can focus on the cost of a ticket, but if you really want to try to move the numbers, you should just be doing a bit of a self-examination to say, you know, what are we doing to make sure that our patrons and our future patrons and the supporters that we want, people that we want to participate in cultural activities, how are they reflected in the content that we're delivering? So I think that's the key takeaway here from that perspective. A lot of times we talk about technology. I get many times I'm asked from organizations, should we have an app? Everybody talks about having an app of some sort on the phone and that being some kind of panacea to solve all your problems. But you know, what's interesting is that when we think of technology and the integration of technology and culture, the best way to think of this is that it's pretty clear from the research that in certain instances, people are open and want to see an integration of digital technology with a cultural event. And you know, when you look at this, so for example, you know, the top scores for this are over on the right. You know, so science, innovation, tech museum, art and design, popular music, zoo or aquarium, botanical garden. You can see that Ontarians are more open to having an integrated digital cultural experience. But check out the numbers on the other side of the equation. You know, when we look at classical music, ballet, opera, non-musical play, musical, festival, that people by a significant margin do not want or are not interested or have an appetite to integrate digital technology. What does this mean? And you know, think about what I said before. People want to be transported to another place. They want to have a reaction, an emotional reaction to something. And I think what's clear here is that for certain types of cultural activities, technology is not part of that experience that people want. They want to have a more personal human experience. That said, there are specific places and times where when it comes to a particular cultural activity that people are much more open to technology. So don't think of technology as either as a cookie cutter solution that cuts across all the different types of cultural activities. Ask yourself, is there an educational component? Is there even a science or technology component or a technical component? And then perhaps that might mean that you can integrate digital technology. But if you're thinking of what I'll say, a response to art or an artist or an experience, that people are more likely to want to have an experience that is not digital. Kind of, I guess we'll call it old school, retro hour. That's really what they want for those types of activities. On the donation front, is interesting. I think one of the problems is that people think, or some people think in Ontario that, hey, my taxes are already paying to support cultural activities. Why should I support cultural activities? And you can see when we ask Ontarians why they did not donate to a cultural organization, the top response was, the taxes that they pay already supported cultural organizations. And you can see Anglophones are more likely to believe that than Allophones. The other number that really pops is that I haven't been asked. I haven't been asked. That should be kind of a significant wake-up call for any cultural organization across Ontario, that just the mere act of asking is probably the very first step. The other thing is that you can see cultural organizations don't have a personal importance to me, that only 5% or 1 out of every 20 allophones said that, while it goes up to 1 out of every 4 anglophones. And this goes to what I'll say, that allophone market, those individuals that are more global in view, global personally because they speak a language other than English or French at home, believe that there's a personal connection that they have to cultural organizations. So this personal connection being kind of a key driver. And of course, there's 7%. We don't know who those people are, but anyway, 7% outright say, yeah, cultural organizations don't need the funding. But I think the key takeaway here is the cultural sector in Ontario has to do a better job at straight out asking for funds. And we have to think of it this way. When the cultural sector is competing with other sectors that deal with humanitarian relief, that deal with the environment, that people are used to being asked. And many of these other sectors are actually very good at being asked, and people are conditioned to waiting to be asked. And perhaps one of the key things here is that we can take away from the research is that asking is probably the first step. And then the second step would be to articulate, I'll call it more of a macro message or a high level message, to say, yes, taxes do support cultural organizations, but that's not enough. Basically to kind of create the demand, but then also to have basically what I'll call the straight up ask for money. And you can see in terms of drivers for donations, and here you can see the numbers where we compare Ontario to Canada, because the study that we did for Business for the Arts was a national study with this Ontario oversample to have some really robust data. But you can see the top drivers in Ontario: belief in the cause, purpose, and mission, value of the impact on the local community. You can see community coming up a lot in Ontario, and this is where kind of community-based cultural organizations is a very good kind of positioning or place in the marketplace for a lot of cultural activities, and then to connect that to the cause, purpose, and mission. The interesting thing is, the ones at the bottom, value the impact it makes on the world. Yeah, that's still a pretty good number. More than 1 out of every 2 Ontarians and Canadians say that's a motivator. But you can see community overrides world as a driver to donate. And I think people want to support artists and cultural activities that connect with them personally, that are more relevant and proximate to their day-to-day lives. And they think that they can have an impact because of the mission that these cultural organizations have, an impact not only on them personally in terms of the experiences that they're going to have, but a positive impact when it comes to their local community. So I'm going to wrap up. For those real research geeks, here you can read the fine print. So this was a larger study of 6,400 Canadians, and this was a pretty exciting project to work on for business and arts, because we basically established a benchmark. It'll be interesting to see in the future how the numbers might move or not move, but there you have it. Key takeaways. Think of allophones as more global in perspective and connected to cultural activities. Think of people being motivated not just by mission, but connection to community. It's very important for the sector just to straight out ask for support, and also to educate Ontarians that yes, although the arts does receive support from the government, it is not a fully government subsidized endeavor, and that we need Ontarians to step up to support the arts in Ontario. So that's it for me. Hope you have a great rest of the day.